Your wife was at work. Margaret Whitmore's eyes lit up with predatory interest when I mentioned my wife's job. What kind of work keeps someone away during normal neighbor interaction hours? She was about to find out the hard way. Police chief work. Let me tell you how this HOA tyrant destroyed herself. For 15 years, my wife Sarah and I had lived the American dream in Oakwood Estates. Let me tell you about Margaret Whitmore. Margaret Whitmore was our neighborhood's self-appointed dictator, 50s, steel gray hair and a death grip bun, and the kind of smile that made children hide behind their parents. She wore designer glasses like a crown and carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent years in middle management and never gotten over the power trip. Margaret had moved into the biggest house on Maple Drive 3 years ago and immediately started her hostile takeover of the HOA. Within 6 months, she'd driven out every reasonable board member and surrounded herself with spineless yes-men who were too terrified to challenge her increasingly insane interpretations of neighborhood rules. But here's what made Margaret truly dangerous. She was a master manipulator. When city officials or potential allies were around, she'd transform into this sweet, concerned neighbor complete with homemade cookies and fake Southern charm. She'd talk about community standards and protecting property values like she was some kind of suburban hero. The second she thought nobody important was watching, the mask would slip. That's when you'd see the real Margaret, a woman who got sexual satisfaction from wielding power over people, who treated HOA covenants like they were handed down from God himself, and who genuinely believed she had the right to control how people lived in their own homes. She had no idea she was about to pick a fight with someone who commanded real authority, not just make-believe HOA power. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Margaret made the biggest mistake of her miserable life. Sarah was at the police station for her final week of transition meetings before officially taking over as chief. She'd been pulling 18-hour days, meeting with precinct commanders, reviewing budgets, preparing for the massive responsibility of leading 800 officers. I was deep in a video conference with clients in Singapore when the assault on our front door began. This wasn't polite knock. This was psychological warfare. Margaret Whitmore stood on our porch jabbing our doorbell, like she was trying to crack the code to Fort Knox. Through my office window, I watched this woman having a complete meltdown because we weren't jumping to attention fast enough for Her Royal Highness. She had her professional-grade camera out, documenting our failure to respond like she was gathering evidence for a war crimes trial. For 26 minutes, I timed it because I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. Margaret alternated between punishing our doorbell and pounding on our door with her fists. When she spotted me through the window, she started gesturing frantically, mouthing words I couldn't hear but definitely understood. I know you're in there. For 26 minutes, she assaulted our doorbell. Furious we wouldn't acknowledge her authority. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah was at that very moment reviewing personnel files for every officer in the city. What she definitely didn't know was that by the time she stormed off our porch, she'd already set in motion the events that would expose her for exactly what she was and destroy everything she'd built. 30 minutes after Margaret's theatrical exit, 2 patrol cars pulled up to our house. Officers Rodriguez and Kim approached with a kind of professional courtesy mixed with embarrassment that told me they'd been down this road before. "Sir, we received a welfare check request," Rodriguez said, already looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Complainant claimed she'd been trying to reach someone at this address for an emergency and was concerned about welfare. I explained that my wife was at work, and I'd been on conference calls all morning. That's when Kim asked a question that made everything click. Was a complainant driving a white Cadillac, gray hair, looks like she'd just bit into a lemon? Margaret Whitmore from 1247 Maple Drive. I confirmed. Both officers visibly deflated. Rodriguez pulled out a notepad that looked like it had seen heavy action. "Sir, this is Mrs. Whitmore's 14th call to our department in 6 months. Previous complaints include suspicious walking patterns, aggressive grass cutting, and unauthorized garbage compositioning." I was stunned. "She calls you guys about garbage cans?" "Last month she called because the Hendersons were having a birthday party for their granddaughter," Kim explained. She reported it as possible domestic disturbance because she heard children laughing too loudly. That's when I made my first mistake. I thought I could reason with crazy. After the officers left, I walked over to Margaret's house. thinking two adults could work this out like civilized people. Margaret opened her door wearing the smug expression like my appearance on her doorstep proved she was the queen of the neighborhood. Before I could speak, she launched into a prepared speech about community standards and proper neighbor protocols. Mrs. Whitmore, I interrupted gently. There was no emergency. My wife was at work. I was on business calls. If there's ever a real emergency. Your wife was at work? Margaret's eyes lit up with predatory interest. What kind of work keeps someone away during normal neighbor interaction hours? She's in law enforcement. I said, thinking this might earn us some respect and end the harassment. Law enforcement? Margaret leaned forward like a vulture. What kind? Court security? Parking enforcement? Here's where I made the mistake that changed everything. She's about to become police chief. Margaret's face went through several expressions before settling on something cold and calculating. Police chief, she repeated slowly. How very interesting. I left that conversation thinking I'd build a bridge. I had no idea I'd just declared war on a woman who saw my wife's authority as a direct threat to her tiny kingdom. Sarah listened to my account of Margaret's harassment with the calm professionalism of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bullies, but I could see the strategic wheels turning in her head. Let me get this straight, Sarah said, reviewing the incident reports I requested through public records. She's been weaponizing police resources to harass neighbors for 6 months, and now she knows I'm about to become the person every officer in this city reports to. Think she'll back down? I asked. Sarah's smile was colder than a morgue freezer. Dave, I've spent 25 years dealing with people who abuse power. Margaret Whitmore is about to get a master class in the difference between HOA authority and real legal consequences. The next morning, Sarah made a call to James Morrison, the city's most respected municipal attorney. Morrison had handled police oversight cases for 15 years and knew exactly how to deal with people who misuse emergency services. By afternoon, Morrison was sitting in our living room with a briefcase full of legal weapons that would make Margaret's HOA violation notices look like kindergarten drawings. What we're dealing with here, Morrison explained, spreading documents across our coffee table, is systematic harassment using public resources. 14 false police reports in 6 months, all targeting specific neighbors who've somehow crossed Mrs. Whitmore. Morrison pulled out a thick legal document. I prepared a comprehensive cease and desist letter that outlines every statute she's violated: misuse of emergency services, harassment, stalking, and potential civil rights violations if we can prove she's targeting specific demographics. But here's the real weapon, Morrison continued, pulling out another file. I've documented every single call she's made to every city department over the past 2 years. Building permits, code enforcement, animal control, fire department. She's filed 63 complaints against neighbors, and not one of them was legitimate. Sarah leaned forward. James, I want you to prepare something else. The day I officially take over as chief, I want a complete audit of all emergency responses to Margaret's address. Response times, officer statements, resources diverted from real emergencies. If she's going to waste taxpayer money, she's going to face the consequences. Morrison grinned. Are we talking criminal charges? We're talking about protecting this community from someone who's been terrorizing it for 3 years, Sarah replied. Margaret Whitmore needs to learn that actions have consequences. As Morrison packed up his briefcase, he handed me the cease and desist letter. Mr. Chun, I strongly recommend you deliver this personally. Make sure she understands that her behavior is now officially documented, and any escalation will result in immediate legal action. I had no idea that Margaret's response to our legal warning would be so spectacularly stupid that it would give us everything we needed to destroy her completely. If you're still watching, buckle in, because what Margaret does next, it turns this into a full-blown suburban war. Hit subscribe if you love watching karma hit loud in public. Margaret received our cease and desist letter on a Friday evening. By Monday morning, she had launched the most vindictive public harassment campaign our neighborhood had ever witnessed. I discovered the scope of her retaliation when I opened our front door to find violation notices plastered on every surface. Our mailbox, front door, garage door, and even taped to my truck windshield. Each notice was printed on official HOA letterhead with the kind of bureaucratic authority that Margaret wielded like a medieval sword. Violation notice number 1. Unauthorized landscaping modifications, wildflower garden. Violation notice number 2. Mailbox positioning noncompliance, 2.3 inches from regulation. Violation notice number 3. Inappropriate vehicle storage, work truck in own driveway. Violation notice number 4. Noise violations, conference calls during quiet hours. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just paperwork warfare. She escalated to full-scale public humiliation. She spent the next 3 days conducting what could only be described as a surveillance operation against our property, parking her white Cadillac directly across from our house and photographing every person who entered or left. The breaking point came Wednesday morning, when Sarah was preparing to leave for her final transition meetings before officially becoming police chief. She stepped out of our house in full dress uniform, navy blue with silver stars that commanded respect from every law enforcement officer in the city, and found Margaret waiting in our driveway like some kind of suburban Gestapo. "Excuse me." Margaret marched directly into our private driveway, camera in one hand, clipboard in the other. "I need to discuss your household's complete disregard for community standards and your husband's threats against a volunteer board member." Sarah turned slowly, and I watched from our kitchen window as Margaret got her first real look at the woman she'd been harassing. The uniform, the bearing, the quiet authority of someone who commanded respect in life-and-death situations for 25 years. "Ma'am, I'm heading to work," Sarah said with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to sound like a final warning. "Work can wait." Margaret snapped, apparently blind to every signal that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. "Your husband came to my house with legal threats, and I want you to know that I will not be intimidated by people who think they're above the rules that govern decent communities." Sarah stepped closer, and even from 50 feet away, I could see Margaret unconsciously take a step backward. "Mrs. Whitmore, my husband delivered a cease and desist letter because your harassment of our family has crossed legal boundaries. I strongly suggest you review that document and govern yourself accordingly." Harassment? Margaret's voice reached a pitch that probably registered on seismographs. "I'm protecting this community from people who move in here and think they can do whatever they want. And waving around some rent-a-cop uniform doesn't give you the right to—" "Rent-a-cop." Sarah's voice dropped to the tone that had made career criminals wet themselves during interrogations. "Mrs. Whitmore, let me clarify something for you. In 72 hours, I will be sworn in as chief of police for this entire city. Every officer who has responded to your ridiculous complaints will report directly to me. Every taxpayer dollar you've wasted on your personal vendettas will be accounted for." The color drained from Margaret's face as the full magnitude of her miscalculation hit her like a freight train. But Margaret's response was even more spectacular than I could have imagined. That very afternoon, she called an emergency HOA board meeting and sent notices to every house in the neighborhood announcing that certain residents were using intimidation tactics and threatening board members with official retaliation. She had just declared public war on the wrong woman at exactly the wrong time. Monday morning, 10 a.m. sharp, Sarah Chin raised her right hand in the city council chambers and became police chief, with local news cameras capturing our city's first female chief taking the oath of office. Monday morning, 10:47 a.m., Margaret Whitmore's life began to unravel in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. I was working in my office when Sarah texted me, "Operation Accountability is live. Recommend you step outside for the show." From our front porch, I had a perfect view of 1247 Maple Drive as 3 patrol cars pulled up in formation. Leading the team was Sergeant Patricia Williams, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for meticulous documentation and zero tolerance for BS. Williams approached Margaret's door with the kind of professional authority that immediately communicated this was not a social call. When Margaret opened the door, her face went through confusion, recognition, and mounting horror as she realized her weekend complaints had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. "Margaret Whitmore?" Williams asked, though they both knew the answer. "Yes, but I need to explain." "Ma'am, You're being served with criminal citation for misuse of emergency services under Municipal Code 247.3, civil summons for harassment under State Statute 18-9-111, and notice of investigation for potential federal civil rights violations. You have 14 days to respond to these charges. Margaret's voice cracked. On whose authority? William smiled with the same cold satisfaction I'd seen Sarah use on people who thought they were untouchable. On the direct authority of Police Chief Sarah Chun, who has personally reviewed all 14 of your false police reports and determined that criminal charges are warranted. But that was just the opening salvo. At 2 p.m., a city code enforcement officer arrived to conduct a comprehensive compliance inspection of Margaret's property, focusing specifically on the unpermitted modifications she'd made to install her neighborhood surveillance equipment. At 4 p.m., the postal inspector showed up to investigate multiple violations of federal mailbox regulations. At 6 p.m., a process server delivered a restraining order requiring Margaret to stay 500 feet away from our property. The masterstroke came at 7 p.m. when a truck from the city planning department arrived to install a bright orange construction sign directly in front of Margaret's house. Property under investigation. Unauthorized modifications. Compliance required. From across the street, I watched Margaret Whitmore pace frantically in her front yard, finally understanding that she had picked a fight with someone who understood real power and was willing to use every legal tool available to protect her community from domestic terrorists. The visual impact was devastating. Every neighbor could see that Margaret's house was now under official investigation, her perfect facade cracking like a broken mirror. The smoking gun that would end Margaret's reign of terror came from the most unexpected source, Margaret's own meticulous record-keeping obsession. 3 weeks after the investigation began, I received a call from Detective Lisa Park, one of Sarah's most trusted investigators. She asked me to meet her at a coffee shop downtown, away from official channels. Mr. Chun, Park said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. Chief Chun asked me to conduct a thorough investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's activities. What we found goes way beyond harassment. This woman has been conducting a systematic campaign of domestic terrorism. Inside the envelope were photocopies of Margaret's personal files, obtained through a search warrant after neighbors reported seeing her taking photographs of their children and keeping detailed logs of their daily activities. She's been maintaining surveillance files on 43 families, Park explained, complete with photographs, daily schedules, visitor logs, and what she calls compliance ratings based on her personal interpretation of neighborhood standards. Park pulled out a folder labeled Enforcement Targets in Margaret's handwriting. Inside were detailed profiles of every family she'd harassed, with notes like interracial couple, monitor for property value impact, and adopted children, investigate background checks. But the most damning evidence was a leather-bound journal where Margaret had recorded her strategy for maintaining community standards. The entries read like a military campaign plan. Phase 1. Identify non-compliant residents through visual surveillance. Phase 2. Document violations and establish patterns of behavior. Phase 3. Utilize city resources to pressure compliance. Phase 4. Escalate to removal if necessary. Mr. Chun, Park said quietly, she's been planning to drive specific families out of the neighborhood. The Hendersons because they're interracial. The Nguyen's because they're immigrants. Your family because your wife represents authorities she can't control. The final piece of evidence was a letter Margaret had drafted but never sent to the city council, demanding investigation into the hiring practices that allowed unqualified diversity candidates into positions of authority. She had specifically requested Sarah's removal before taking office, claiming she was unsuitable for law enforcement leadership. I called Sarah immediately. Her response was swift and decisive. Lisa's investigation has uncovered evidence of federal hate crimes, Sarah said. We're not dealing with an overzealous HOA president. We're dealing with someone who's been conducting a systematic campaign to ethnically cleanse our neighborhood. That evening, federal agents arrived at Margaret's house with a search warrant. The evidence they seized would not only end her HOA career, but result in federal charges that would follow her for the rest of her life. Margaret Whitmore's house of cards was collapsing, and she still had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center. So, how do you dismantle a suburban tyrant legally, publicly, and in front of all her victims? You're about to find out. And if you love watching power-hungry Karens implode in slow motion, hit that subscribe, because this takedown isn't just personal, it's poetic. For 3 years, Margaret had used these meetings as her personal platform to intimidate neighbors and consolidate power. She had no idea that this Thursday would be the night her entire world came crashing down. Sarah and I arrived at 6:45 p.m. to find the community center packed beyond capacity. Word spread throughout the neighborhood about Margaret's legal troubles, and residents who had been suffering in silence for years were finally ready to speak their truth. Margaret entered at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by her 2 remaining board allies, clearly expecting to conduct damage control and rally support against what she was calling harassment by city officials. She took her seat at the head table, banged her gavel with the authority of a medieval judge, and began reading from her prepared agenda. The first order of business, Margaret announced in her most imperious voice, is addressing the coordinated harassment campaign being conducted against elected board members by certain residents who believe they are above the community's standards that govern decent neighborhoods. That's when Sarah stood up, and the entire room went silent. "Point of order," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded 800 police officers. "Before we proceed with any agenda items, I believe this community deserves to know about the federal criminal investigation currently targeting the board president." Margaret's face went through every color in the spectrum. "You are out of order. This meeting follows parliamentary procedure, and I will not." "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah interrupted, "you are currently facing federal charges for civil rights violations, criminal charges for misuse of emergency services, and a Department of Justice investigation into systematic harassment based on race and ethnicity. I think our neighbors deserve to know that their HOA president is under federal criminal investigation." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. James Morrison stood up from the back of the room with a thick file folder. "I represent 12 families in this room who have been victimized by Mrs. Whitmore's systematic abuse of power. With the community's permission, I'd like to present evidence of criminal behavior that has endangered every family in this neighborhood." Margaret banged her gavel frantically. "This is not the appropriate venue for personal attacks, and actually, it is exactly the appropriate venue," said a commanding voice from the entrance. Federal Agent Maria Santos walked into the room with 2 other agents, all wearing badges that made Margaret's HOA authority look like a child's toy. "Mrs. Whitmore," Agent Santos announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 241. You have the right to remain silent." The room watched in stunned silence as Margaret Whitmore was handcuffed and led away, her perfect suburban dictator facade crumbling completely. As the agents escorted her toward the exit, Margaret's composure finally snapped. "This is all her fault," she screamed, turning to stare directly at Sarah with pure hatred. "Ever since she moved into our neighborhood with her attitude and her authority, thinking she could intimidate hard-working Americans who built this community. People like her don't belong in positions of power." The room went dead silent as Margaret's mask slipped completely, revealing the racist motivation behind her 3-year campaign of terror. "People like me, Mrs. Whitmore?" Sarah asked quietly. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but the words were already out there. In front of 80 witnesses, she had exposed herself as exactly what we'd suspected all along. Agent Santos continued reading Miranda rights as they led Margaret away, her perfect white suburban kingdom collapsing behind her. #, Section 10, Justice and Resolution. 18 months later, Margaret Whitmore's transformation from neighborhood dictator to federal convict was complete, and our community had been reborn from the ashes of her reign of terror. The federal charges resulted in conviction for conspiracy to violate civil rights, carrying an 18-month federal prison sentence and 3 years of supervised probation. The state criminal charges for misuse of emergency services added another $15,000 in fines and 500 hours of community service, specifically working with immigrant families through a cultural understanding program. But the real justice came in the civil settlements. Every family Margaret had targeted sued her for harassment, emotional distress, and civil rights violations. The combined judgments totaled $340,000, forcing her to sell her house and forfeit her retirement savings. The HOA underwent a complete transformation under the leadership of interim President Patricia Johnson, a retired teacher who believed in actual democracy rather than suburban fascism. The new board implemented strict transparency requirements, term limits, and an appeals process for any violations. They also established a community mediation program to resolve disputes without involving law enforcement. Most importantly, they created the Margaret Whitmore Memorial Fund, a scholarship program for immigrant and refugee families buying their first homes in our neighborhood. The irony was not lost on anyone that Margaret's house sale funded opportunities for exactly the families she tried to drive away. The physical transformation of our neighborhood was equally dramatic. Margaret's surveillance equipment was removed and replaced with a beautiful community garden where neighbors could grow vegetables together. The intimidating violation notices were replaced with welcome signs in multiple languages. The house where Margaret had conducted her reign of terror was purchased by a young refugee family from Somalia who painted it bright yellow and filled the yard with flowers. It's wild how one person can poison a neighborhood and how a whole community can rise when that poison is gone. If this hit home for you or reminded you of someone who thinks they're untouchable, hit subscribe, because we got more stories where justice grows strong and bullies lose their crown. But the most satisfying moment came during the dedication ceremony for the new community garden. Sarah stood before 200 neighbors, not as a police chief who brought down a domestic terrorist, but as a neighbor who'd help restore peace to our community. Margaret Whitmore thought she could use fear to control people, Sarah said. But fear is temporary. Community is permanent. What we've built here in the past 18 months proves that when good people stand together, they can overcome any bully. As Sarah spoke, I looked around to faces of neighbors who were no longer afraid to work in their yards, children who could play outside without harassment, families who could live in peace regardless of their race or background. The oak trees in our backyard, the ones that had started this whole conflict, were now thriving more than ever. Sarah had planted new saplings around them, creating a grove that would grow stronger with each passing year. On the largest tree, we'd mounted a small plaque that read, "Justice grows strongest in community soil." Margaret Whitmore had tried to create a neighborhood where only people like her could live in peace. Instead, she created a community where everyone could thrive together, and her legacy would forever be a reminder that hate has no place in a true neighborhood. 6 months ago, we received a letter from Margaret's federal probation officer. She'd been released early for good behavior and was seeking permission to move back to our city. The entire neighborhood signed a petition opposing her return, not out of revenge, but out of protection for the peace we'd built. The request was denied. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. It's about protecting the community that rises from the ashes of someone's attempt to destroy it. Margaret Whitmore thought she could terrorize a police officer's family, but instead she discovered that when you mess with someone who's dedicated their life to protecting others, you don't just face consequences. You become a cautionary tale. Our neighborhood is stronger, more diverse, and more welcoming than ever before. And every time I see those oak trees reaching toward the sky, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something beautiful from the wreckage of someone else's hate. Got your own HOA horror story or dealt with a neighborhood tyrant? Drop it in the comments below. Subscribe AS Stories YouTube channel. I love hearing how communities fight back against bullies. If the story of justice served made your day, smash that subscribe button for more tales of karma delivered and power-hungry jerks getting exactly what they deserve. Trust me, Margaret Whitmore wasn't the only suburban dictator who learned you can't mess with the wrong family.